The station was trying to tell him something was wrong with Reactor 2's coolant coupling. 18 minutes before the Var'Keth Dominion told him the same thing about his life. Teo heard it first. Not an alarm. The alarms were fine. The alarms were green. The alarms were the last thing you trusted down here. What he heard was a frequency shift in the magnetic containment hum, a half-tone drop in the pitch of the coil that ran along the starboard side of the secondary chamber, the kind of sound that only registered if you'd spent enough time in sub-level 8 to let the station's normal voice become the baseline against which everything else was measured. He'd been here 3 years. He heard it. He heard. He set down his rice container, cold, sealed with a lid that had his name written on it in black marker, because the break room refrigerator had 16 people's lunches in it and nobody wanted a mix-up, and he crouched next to the coupling housing with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to every job that mattered. The station recycled its air down here, and it always smelled like wet concrete and the faint metallic edge of ionized deuterium, not unlike a bad night at a refinery outside Beaumont, Texas, where he'd once helped seal a ruptured hydrogen line in the dark with a failing headlamp and a roll of fiberglass tape. That had been a different life. Also, not that different. The coupling was stressed. Minor, maybe a 2% variance in the seal pressure. Nothing the automated systems had flagged, because the automated systems had flagged the wrong threshold in 2019, and nobody had recalibrated them since, because the recalibration required taking the reactor offline for 6 hours, and the station's power manager kept deferring it. Teo had filed the report. He'd filed it 3 times. He kept a physical copy in his toolkit. He opened the toolkit lid. The photo was there, taped inside. Danilo at 17, standing on the dock in Batangas with both arms out and a fish in each hand, and his face doing the thing it did when he was trying not to smile too big because he thought it made him look young. Teo didn't look at it. He knew it was there. He'd known it was there for 14 months. That was enough. He reached for the channel lock pliers and started working. Meridian Station wasn't a warship. It wasn't a research outpost, wasn't a listening post. Wasn't any of the things that might logically attract the attention of a conquest empire 17 light minutes from the nearest jump relay. It was a colony. It was people, 4,200 of them, who had come out to the Kepler belt to do the thing that people had always done when they ran out of room. Move, build, make something. The station had 3 fusion reactors and a deuterium processing facility, and a school and a market and a medical bay and a bar that made a decent approximation of Red Horse, if you didn't think too hard about what the fermentation substrate actually was. It had families. It had a kindergarten class of 23 children currently asleep in the upper levels, because it was 3 in the morning on the station's manufactured clock cycle, and children slept on manufactured clocks the same as any other kind. Teo had been contracted to maintain the fusion grid. He was supposed to have gone home a year ago. His contract had been up, his bags had been half-packed, and then he'd stood in his apartment in Houston for one evening looking at walls that had the right furniture in them but the wrong weight, the too light feeling of a space that no longer had anyone else's gravity in it. He'd called Annalisa. She'd said, "Dad, you don't have to keep working." He'd said, "I know." Then he'd called the contract office and signed another 18 months because a faulty coolant system on a fusion reactor in the Kepler belt needed someone who knew the sound of stressed metal and had the patience to crouch next to it at 3 in the morning until he understood what it was saying. He was retorquing the coupling. Left hand on the wrench, 3-fingered grip, the grip he'd adapted over 20 years since the dock explosion that had taken the index and middle fingers in one clean instant, and that the Philippine Navy had classified as non-combat, and therefore not their pension problem. When the station shuddered, not the resonance of a coolant pressure shift, not the harmonic of a coil adjustment. This was different. This was the whole station inhaling sharply, the kind of full-body shudder that a structure makes when something has hit it with a great deal of focused force and then all the lights went wrong. Emergency amber replacing the white overhead panels. And then the alarms, real ones. Not the maintenance kind, but the station-wide emergency kind. The one he'd heard once in a drill and hoped never to hear for real. He stood up. He looked at the comm panel on the wall. It was the nearest active terminal. He crossed to it. Then every terminal on the station did something he'd never seen before. simultaneously. All of them. The frequency shifted to something external, and the translated synthetic voice of a station comm system that was now relaying someone else's broadcast said, in flat, affectless compact standard, "Attention, Softwalker colony. You are now under the authority of Warlord Sektavan of the Var'Keth Dominion. Surrender your command codes and prepare for boarding. Resistance will result in total platform destruction. You have one standard cycle, approximately 19 of your minutes, to comply." Silence. The hum of the containment field, the slightly off pitch of the stressed coupling he hadn't quite finished fixing. Then a different alarm. Command deck, non-responsive. Life signs on levels 1 through 3. Absent. The kinetic strike had been precise. Levels 1 through 3 housed the command staff, the navigation systems, and the communications hub. It had also, incidentally, housed the route to the kindergarten class, which was why 23 children were now sealed below the strike line in a school that no longer had an upper exit. Teo looked at the comm panel. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took him to complete the assessment. He was the nearest active terminal, the command deck was gone, and somebody needed to answer before 19 minutes ran out, and whatever the Var'Keth Dominion did after 19 minutes happened to 4,200 people. He also, in those 4 seconds, pulled up the distress beacon menu. He activated it, quietly, in the background. Then he picked up the comm. "Yeah," he said. "This is Meridian Station. You hit our command deck. You're talking to the power plant." There was a pause on the other end that he didn't have the alien xenological context to interpret, but that felt even through a translation relay, like the pause of a script encountering a line it didn't contain. When the voice came back, it was different. Not the synthetic relay. This was direct, translated by the station system into compact standard, but carrying something underneath the translation, a texture of authority that was used to not having to repeat itself. Warlord Sektavan of the Var'Keth Dominion was, apparently, the kind of commander who came on the line personally when things didn't go according to the script. He repeated the demand. Command codes. Boarding preparation. Compliance. The words were the same. The expectation under them was absolute. Teo asked, "How long did you say we actually have?" Another pause. 19 of your minutes. This is not a negotiation, Softwalker. It is a... "Okay," Teo said. "Sit tight." He closed the channel. He picked up his toolkit. He started walking. He had 12 minutes before the first breach team came through Sub-Level 9's emergency access port, and he used all 12 of them. He used them because he knew this station the way he had once known every refinery on the Gulf Coast, not the blueprints, though he had those memorized too, but the physical reality of the place, the weight of the doors, the specific give of the deck plating in certain corridors, the way the coolant lines ran behind the walls and where the junction boxes were. He knew where the water was. He knew where the power was. He knew where the air was. He'd run emergency drills on this station. He'd filed complaints that the emergency plans were inadequate. He'd been told the plans were fine. He'd gone home and made his own. Teo was not a soldier. He had served 6 years in the Philippine Navy Engineering Corps, and what he had taken from that time was not combat training, but something older and more durable. The understanding that a system under stress will fail at its weakest point, and that the job is always to find the weakest point before the failure does. The Navy had left him with 2 missing fingers and a non-combat classification, and a working knowledge of what happens to large mechanical systems when you introduce the wrong kind of energy at the right kind of moment. He'd been doing that job ever since. He was doing it now. The first breach team came in 6 strong standard kinetic-resistant armor, plasma rifles, moving in the formation that the Var'Keth apparently used for what their doctrine called compliance enforcement. 2 forward, 2 middle, 2 rear, covering angles, moving like they'd done this before and had never been given reason to do it differently. They were professional. Teo respected professional. They were also moving through a corridor that was ankle-deep in coolant fluid. The deuterium-suppressed coolant was non-explosive in its current state. That was important. He was precise about these things. It was, however, extremely electrically conductive, and the corridor lighting had been cut entirely. His cut, a physical disconnect at the junction box 12 meters back. So the breach team was moving in total darkness, through liquid they hadn't expected and couldn't see. Their armor had built-in illumination. He'd accounted for that. The illumination systems ran on the same electromagnetic frequency band as the armor's joint assist systems, and both of them emitted a trackable signal. The Fluke T6 non-contact voltage tester fit in one hand. He'd bought it at a supply depot in Beaumont in 2031 and had never found a reason to replace it. In the dark, it tracked electromagnetic signatures through the coolant fluid with the calm, unambiguous precision of a tool that simply did what it was made to do. He knew where they were. They did not know where he was. He ran 480 volts from the grid reset capacitors through the coolant layer. The panel wiring took 40 seconds to redirect with the channel lock pliers. 40 seconds in the dark, by feel, gloved hands that had done this kind of work in worse conditions. And then he closed the circuit. 6 soldiers, 6 electromagnetic signatures. All of them went non-responsive within 8 seconds. He didn't find this satisfying. He stood in the dark in the silence that followed, and he assessed the situation with the same flat attention he gave a bad circuit. Locates it, notes the state, moves to the next problem. He replaced the panel cover. He moved. Somewhere above him on the Var'Keth vessel, a warlord was looking at 6 non-responsive life signs and doing his own assessment. The comm channel opened. The warlord's voice flat with something that might have been confusion and might have been the early edge of anger. Softwalker, 6 of my soldiers have gone non-responsive. Explain. Teo was already moving through the sub-level 8 maintenance corridor, heading for the position he needed to reach before the second team came through the upper access in sub-level 7. He keyed the comm without stopping. Your guys walked into a wet floor, he said. I've got a sign up, not my fault they couldn't read it. He closed the channel. He had 12 minutes before the second team. He used them differently. The Var'Keth were logical. That was the thing about a conquest empire that had absorbed 31 species without a single military loss in 200 years. They were logical because logic had always worked, because every enemy they'd encountered had responded to force display the way the xenological playbook said an enemy would respond, because 31 species worth of data had confirmed that the pattern held. You displayed overwhelming force. You made the compliance demand. You waited the requisite time. The enemy, understanding the arithmetic, complied. The logic said, if the first team failed due to unknown environmental factors, the second team accounts for environmental factors and enters from a different point. There were 3 ways into sub-level 8. 2 were now compromised. The third was the upper access on sub-level 7, and the Var'Keth would send a larger team through it, because the Var'Keth were logical. Teo's emergency plan, the one he'd made himself, not the official one, had a note about sub-level 7 upper access. The note said, good choke point, single corridor for 30 meters before it branches, low ceiling, limited lateral movement. The note also said, fire suppression system junction is 8 meters from the entrance hatch, and the deuterium coolant secondary line runs directly above the corridor ceiling for the full 30-meter stretch. He worked fast. He was good at working fast. He'd sealed a ruptured coolant main on a Gulf Coast refinery with 2 men down and a fire spreading at 11 meters per minute. And he'd done it in 4 minutes because 4 minutes was what was available, and so 4 minutes was what he used. He vented a controlled quantity of deuterium coolant into the corridor in gas form. Not enough to reach explosive concentration. Precisely, not that he was precise about these things. And he triggered the CO2 suppression system simultaneously. The combination dropped the oxygen content in the 30-meter corridor section to 14%. He confirmed it with his atmospheric tester. 14%. The Var'Keth Dominion's field armor included an atmospheric sensor that would read the structural atmosphere beyond the corridor walls and call it normal, because the sensors weren't designed to read localized atmospheric pockets. They were designed to detect station-wide threats, not a 30-meter column of carefully displaced air. He put on his respirator. The 3M 6500 series half-face with P100 cartridges. He'd carried it in his toolkit for 15 years, since the job in Beaumont where a failed valve had dumped hydrogen sulfide into a maintenance access, and the man ahead of him had gone down in seconds. He breathed through it, now calm, normal. The way you breathed when the equipment was good and you trusted it. Var'Keth physiology required higher oxygen partial pressure than humans. It was in the compact xenobiological database, available to anyone who looked. He'd looked because he read the technical files on every species his station might interact with, because information was a maintenance tool like any other. At 18%, they began to slow. At 16, motor coordination declined. At 14, they had about 90 seconds before they couldn't reliably lift their weapons. He had spent 25 years in confined spaces with bad air. His blood oxygen efficiency was not a special trait. It was a trained condition, the same way his three-fingered grip was a trained condition, an adaptation built by decades of work in environments that didn't accommodate you, so you accommodated them instead. He moved through the corridor with the pipe wrench, the rigid 24-inch. It was a tool. He used it as a tool, with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly how much force was needed and where. He put down 4 soldiers before they could compensate. The other 4 were losing coordination before he reached them. He did not make this dramatic. He moved through the corridor in the low oxygen dark, breathing steadily through the 100 cartridges. And he did the job. When he came out the other side, he keyed the comm. The warlord's voice came back almost immediately this time. The translation was flatter now, but there was something behind it, not anger exactly. Something more like the quality of attention that a person gives a problem that is not behaving like problems are supposed to behave. What is happening to my soldiers? Their armor reads structural atmosphere as normal. What have you done to the air? Teo was already moving, assessing the route to the reactor floor, the position he'd need for what came next. Coolant leak, he said. These things happen. You want me to send you the maintenance report? He closed the channel. The warlord sent 12 next. A full tactical squad, 3-man cells, atmospheric filters equipped this time. He'd adapted, and Teo had expected him to adapt because the Var'Keth were logical, and Teo respected that. 12 soldiers with atmospheric filters and a warlord who was now, certainly, past patience. They came through multiple entry points simultaneously, the way a tactical mind responds to a pattern of choke point engagements. Don't let the choke point define the engagement. Teo fell back to the reactor floor. He didn't fall back because he was losing. He fell back because the reactor floor was where he needed to be. Reactor 2's magnetic confinement system was, per the official spec sheet, a precisely calibrated piece of equipment with tolerances defined by the manufacturer and a resonance frequency that was not to be adjusted outside of controlled maintenance windows under the supervision of a licensed fusion systems engineer. Teo was a licensed fusion systems engineer. He had also adjusted the resonance frequency twice before in emergency situations, because he had spent enough time with Reactor 2 to know that the spec sheet was conservative, written conservative as spec sheets were, to account for the lowest common denominator of operator competence, and that the machine's actual tolerances were meaningfully different from what the documentation claimed. The resonance field adjustment was technically forbidden. He was going to do it anyway. The sign on the wall behind him read, "Do not modify magnetic confinement resonance without authorization." He had, at some point in the last 3 years, written, "What do you think I'm doing on the sign and marker?" He did not look at the sign. He looked at the control interface. What the field adjustment did, at the specific frequency he selected, was create a 15-meter radius in which any ferrous material or electromagnetically active system experienced significant magnetic induction effects. The Var'Keth combat armor used an electromagnetic joint assist system for load bearing. It was a practical choice for soldiers carrying heavy kinetic-resistant plate, a way to let the suit do some of the lifting so the soldier inside could move. It was also, in a 15-meter magnetic induction field running at the frequency Teo selected, a catastrophic design choice. The first cell of 3 entered the reactor floor and stopped. Their armor froze, not all at once. The process took about 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds of very confusing loss of motor control for soldiers whose equipment was suddenly working against them, before the joint assist systems locked rigid under the induction load, and the soldiers inside them became statues. The second cell's armor didn't lock. It was attracted. Violently and suddenly attracted. at a rate that was not something a soldier inside kinetic-resistant plate was prepared for, toward the reactor housing. 2 of them hit the wall. The third managed to brace against a support column, which was impressive coordination under the circumstances. Teo walked through the field. He was wearing no powered equipment. His tools were hand tools. His boots were rubber-soled. Physics didn't care about his intentions. It only cared about his materials, and his materials were uninteresting to a magnetic induction field. He'd said that to the warlord once during what had become an ongoing and peculiar conversation. The reactor's magnetic field doesn't care what your armor cost. Physics doesn't negotiate. He meant it as information, not as a taunt. He was past taunting. He was in the part of a bad job where you stopped explaining and just worked. He was working when the plasma shot caught him. One soldier outside the 15-meter radius kneeling at the edge with a clear angle. He'd gotten off a partial shot before the field's edge took his targeting system. Partial shot, not a full bolt. A partial bolt from a plasma rifle was still a plasma bolt. It was just smaller. It caught him across the left side of his torso. He registered it as heat first. Not even pain, precisely, not immediately. Because that's what adrenaline does, what the norepinephrine cascade does, what the human body does when it has decided that the situation requires continued function, rather than immediate acknowledgement of damage. He took stock. He was still moving. 4 ribs, approximate burn depth. The work shirt destroyed, approximately 30% surface tissue loss across that area. His left arm still worked. His legs still worked. His grip, 3-fingered and adapted, still worked. He reached into his kit. The 3M Scotch 69 fiberglass tape, thermal insulation, rated for high heat pipe joints, keeps its integrity at temperatures his burned skin was now roughly approximating. He wrapped it tight against his left side, tight enough to limit movement of the burned tissue, tight enough to keep it together while he kept moving. He did not stop. He did not make a sound. Not because he was performing toughness. There was no one in the room to perform for. But because stopping and making sounds were actions with costs and this was a resource allocation problem. And he was allocating. The alien medic who would later examine him would use the word pushed through as a borrowed phrase because there was no clinical term in any xenobiological lexicon for what Teo's nervous system did in the next 40 minutes. The human frontal lobe, it turned out, had a documented capacity to override pain, interrupt signals during survival states, not suppress them, not remove them, but route around them, the way a good field tech routes power around a blown junction, keeping the system running on the backup path until the primary can be repaired. Terran neuroscientists called it executive override. The alien medic would call it, in her formal report, a property of human neural architecture that we did not anticipate, because the humans we had previously encountered had not required us to. The Var'Keth xenological database's entry for Terrans had not included this information. The database said, low combat initiative, high social compliance under threat, no documented history of organized armed resistance, probability of sustained violent response less than 4%. Category 2, compliance species. Recommended approach, single demand surrender protocol, minimal force display. The database had been compiled from observations of humans who had been offered a surrender protocol. The humans had taken the surrender protocol. The database had concluded this was because humans lacked the capacity for sustained resistance under force. This was, Teo thought, while walking through his own ship on fire, exactly the kind of mistake that came from insufficient sample size. The warlord's voice came over the comm. This time there was no translation artifact, no flattening. The station's system was rendering the audio more faithfully now, or perhaps the warlord's voice had shifted into a register that translated more directly. What came through was the quality of a mind encountering something it had no existing framework to process. What are you? You are not a soldier. What are you? Teo was moving through the sub-level corridors, bleeding into the fiberglass tape, making for the blast door controls. He had one more thing to do before he could stop. I'm the repairman, he said. The blast door controls for sub-level 8 were a hydraulic override system. Manual, mechanical, not connected to the electronic systems because the designers had understood that in an emergency, the electronic systems might be precisely the problem. To actuate it, you inserted the override bar and applied sustained force. 90 seconds of sustained force through a series of ratcheting cycles. It was a job designed for a healthy adult. Teo was a healthy adult who had, in the last hour and a half, run 480 volts through a coolant floor, navigated a low-oxygen corridor with a pipe wrench, walked through a magnetic induction field that had flattened 12 soldiers, and taken a partial plasma bolt across 4 ribs. He did the 90 seconds. He counted them. He applied the force through the 3-finger grip that was stronger in the remaining fingers than most people's full hands, through a left side that was singing in ways he was currently declining to hear, through a body that his own autonomic nervous system had essentially decided to keep running regardless of what the damage report said. Ratchet by ratchet. The hydraulics engaged. The blast door sealed with a sound like a coffin lid. Not that, he told himself, not that, just a door. Just a very good door between the hallway and the break room where 214 people were waiting, including 23 children who had needed to come down here when the upper exit was destroyed. He sat down against the wall next to the blast door. He could hear them on the other side. He could hear a voice, low and steady, singing. He thought it was Patience Adeyemi, the nurse who'd been managing 4 critical injuries with no surgical equipment and whatever she had in her kit. He couldn't make out the words. The melody was something he didn't recognize. He thought it was Yoruba. He thought it was a song for children, the kind that says, "You are safe, you are here, I am here, this is going to be okay." He closed his eyes. He intended 30 seconds. He got a little more than that. The compact rapid response corvette dropped out of FTL 19 minutes after the distress beacon. Not because the compact was fast, it wasn't. The compact council operated by consensus and was constitutionally cautious. But because the corvette had already been in the sector, running patrol routes, and the beacon had given it a direction. The beacon that Teo had activated from the power plant terminal during the first comm exchange, quietly in the background before he'd ever reached for the channel lock pliers. Commander Isolde Reese of the Tavari had been in 40 military engagements. The Tavari were a species that considered themselves experienced with the realities of violence. She walked the maintenance corridors of sub-level 7 through 9 with her boarding team fanned behind her, and she said nothing for a long time. A Var'Keth soldier was fused to the reactor housing by his own armor, the electromagnetic joint assist locked so thoroughly by the induction field that the suit had essentially become part of the structure. He was conscious. He was staring at the ceiling. His eyes moved when Reese passed him, and he said something in Var'Keth that her translator rendered as, "What is wrong with them?" Another soldier was seated against a wall, every joint of his exo-armor locked rigid, still conscious, the face visible through the visor registering an expression that had started as combat readiness, and somewhere along the way had become something else. The something else was hard to name. It was the expression of a mind that has encountered a category of event that its training did not account for, and is still in the process of determining what category this event belongs to. The oxygen corridor still read low. There were scorch marks at knee height on one wall, the level a man would hold a pipe wrench. There were exactly no human bodies anywhere in the sublevels. Reese found the blast door. It was sealed from the inside, manual override, hydraulic actuation. A job, her engineers told her, that would require significant sustained force for a single operator. On the outside of the door, against the wall, was a cold container of rice with someone's name written on it in marker. They cut through the blast door from the outside. On the other side, 214 civilians, including 23 children and a nurse who had kept 4 people alive with improvised equipment. And against the wall next to the interior hydraulic controls, wearing the burned remnants of a Cascade Energy Systems work shirt and a wrap of thermal fiberglass tape across his left ribs, was a man who had, by the evidence of the corridors behind him, just done something that Reese had no existing category for. She knelt next to him. He opened his eyes. "The reactor's fine," he said. His voice was flat and slightly hoarse. "Containment's stable. You'll want to retorque the coolant coupling on number 2 before you bring it back to full load." He paused. He seemed to be running an assessment, checking something internal. "There's rice in the break room if it's not cold yet. Should still be okay." His eyes closed. His body, having completed its checklist, allowed itself to stop. The compact field medic who worked on Teo in the following hour was a Drevani named Cho Ri, who had treated 12 different species in the field over a career of 30 years. Her case report was clinical in the way that case reports are supposed to be clinical, precise, documented, evidence-referenced. The recording of her presenting that report to the Compact Emergency Council session, 11 days later, became one of the most viewed documents in Compact political history, though not because of anything dramatic in her delivery. She spoke flatly. The facts were the dramatic element. The subject sustained a Class 3 plasma burn across 4 ribs at an unknown point during the engagement, she said. He subsequently operated for an estimated additional 40 minutes, manually actuated a hydraulic blast seal requiring sustained force application, and then entered a conservation metabolic state. His body had essentially decided to survive and routed all available resources accordingly. His pain suppression was not chemical. There is no evidence of any pain-blocking agent in his system. His nervous system simply continued. We do not have a clinical term for this in Terran physiology. Apparently they do not either. They call it pushing through. There was a pause in the recording. Someone at the council table asked in Tavari, "And the blood volume?" At the time of field assessment, he was operating at approximately 60% of normal blood volume. In most known sapient species, functional motor operation ceases to be reliable below 75%. The Terran response, under conditions of adrenaline override, extends reliable function significantly below that threshold. The exact lower bound is documented in Terran sports medicine literature and is approximately 10% oxygen by atmospheric partial pressure for trained individuals and 50% blood volume for high adrenaline survival states. She paused. These numbers are not classified. They are available in the public Terran medical database. We had simply not had occasion to verify them. Teo woke up 11 days later in the Compact Medical Station on Juno platform, in a room that was clean and slightly too cold, and had the particular non-smell of air that had been filtered and refiltered until it no longer contained enough organic information to register as air. He had a grafted burn patch over his left side that itched. He was immediately told he had been summoned to a Compact Council emergency session. He asked if he could eat first. He was told the summons was urgent. He asked again. He was brought a meal. He ate it. Then he went to the session. The Var'Keth ambassador Tor Vessel was a tall presence, in the way that things which have never had reason to make themselves small are tall, not physically, particularly, but architecturally, in the way he occupied space and the assumption behind his occupation of it. The complaint was formal, filed in compact legal language, triply referenced to standing treaty provisions. Unauthorized military engagement, use of civilian infrastructure as a weapon, unprovoked escalatory action against Dominion personnel acting under standing conquest protocols. The complaint had 3 species on the council nodding along, species that had been neighbors of the Var'Keth Dominion for longer than Teo had been alive and had developed the particular quality of attention that comes from being near something vast and patient and without a record of losses. The argument was clean. Teo had acted without authority, had endangered the station, and the appropriate resolution was to assign liability to a single low-status Terran and a colonial administration that was already too small to push back effectively. This was a tidy solution. It made the problem small and localized and not the compacts. Teo walked in wearing his work clothes. The clean set, the burned set, had been destroyed beyond recovery. The Cascade Energy Systems logo was on the chest. He had a temporary dermal stabilizer patch on his left side that forced him to hold himself slightly stiff. He had considered a cane briefly and declined. He sat at the table assigned to him. He was the only human in the room. He placed a tablet on the table. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at the room. He did not begin with outrage. He did not begin with rhetoric. He read from the tablet. He read the Var'Keth Dominion's own xenological database entry for Terrans. He read it in full, in compact standard, in the same flat declarative voice he used to report maintenance issues and describe stuck coolant valves. Terrans display low combat initiative, he read, high social compliance under threat, and no documented history of organized armed resistance. Probability of sustained violent response, less than 4%. Recommended approach, single demand surrender protocol, minimal force display, Category 2 compliance species. He let the words sit.
Then he read the casualty report. 23 Var'Keth soldiers, all non-lethal outcomes, currently in compact medical custody. He read the civilian casualty count for Meridian Station. 0. He read the number slowly, in case anyone had missed it. Then he put the tablet down. "I want to make sure I understand the complaint," he said. His voice was the same voice he'd used to tell Commander Reese about the coolant coupling. "They showed up. They killed our command staff. They told us to surrender. And the problem, the legal problem you're bringing to this table, is that we didn't." Silence. "I'm not a soldier," he said. "I fix power plants. I was doing a 3 a.m. diagnostic on a coolant coupling when their first team came through the door. I used what was on the shelf." Ambassador Torvessel began to speak. He spoke of the Var'Keth Dominion's military capacity. He spoke of the conquest record, the 31 species absorbed without loss, the historical inevitability that the Dominion's expansion represented, the consequences stated plainly not as a threat, but as an architectural fact, of continued resistance to an entity that had demonstrated in 200 years of consistent practice that resistance produced only additional cost to the resisting party. Teo waited for him to finish. He was patient. He had been patient with stuck valves and failed seals and 3 committee members who wouldn't approve his recalibration request for a period now approaching 18 months. He was very good at patient. "You've been doing this for 200 years, he said, "and you've never had anyone fight back." He let that land. "That's not a record, that's a streak, and now you know what happens when it ends." The ambassador's translator ran the lines, once, twice, 3 times. Translators didn't usually run lines 3 times. They ran them once, maybe twice for complex idiomatic content. 3 times meant the words were coming out correctly, and the problem was in what the words meant. "And I was the repairman," Teo said. The Var'Keth delegation conferred in whispers. The 3 nodding council members were no longer nodding. Warlord Sektovan, attending remotely via comm, the first time in compact diplomatic history that a Var'Keth warlord had attended a council session in any capacity, requested to see Teo's military record. There was a pause while the relevant parties located and transmitted Teo's military record. There was a longer pause while the relevant parties confirmed that what they had located was, in fact, the complete record. Philippine Navy, Engineering Corps, 6 years, honorable discharge, no combat designations, followed by 10 years of Gulf Coast refinery work, followed by a series of fusion grid maintenance contracts on increasingly distant colonial platforms. Nothing else. The warlord's comm channel went silent. The delegation conferred again. The ambassador's translator processed something and then processed it again. The 3 nodding council members had developed an acute interest in the table surface. The session concluded without a formal resolution, which in compact council terms was itself a resolution of a kind. In a corridor outside the chamber afterwards, Commander Reese found him. She was a small woman for a Tavari. They tended toward height, with the kind of stillness that came from having processed a lot of information in a short time and not yet being finished processing it. "The warlord withdrew the complaint," she said, "formally an hour ago." Teo nodded. He also issued a category reclassification request for Terrans, first one in Dominion history apparently. She paused. "The new classification is pending further data, which is the Var'Keth diplomatic phrase for, we don't know what you are yet, and we want more time before we put a label on it." "That's fine," Teo said. "We've got time." He didn't smile. He thought of Danilo briefly, the way he thought of the photo in his toolkit, knowing it was there, not looking directly at it, letting the weight of it do what it did in the background where it lived. 14 months. A navigation accident. the official classification said. He knew what it was. One day that was going to be a different conversation with a different table of people. Not today. What are you going to do now? Reese asked. He thought about it. The burn patch itched. The coupling on Reactor 2 still needed retorquing. The compact boarding team had confirmed containment was stable, but he'd said before going under that the coupling needed attention, and he meant it. There was a backlog of maintenance reports on Meridian Station's sub-level systems going back 18 months that were not going to file themselves. Go back to work, he said. He called his daughter from a comm terminal in the corridor. It was 6 a.m. Houston time. He thought about that for a second. 6 a.m., the specific quality of early morning light on that side of the planet. The sound of Houston waking up with the Gulf humidity already building, and then he called anyway because she'd be getting up for work, and because it had been a while, and because some things you did, regardless of the hour. Annalisa answered on the fourth ring, confused, her voice carrying the specific texture of someone who has been startled from the edge of sleep into partial alertness. Dad, it's still working nights, he said. A pause. He could hear her coming more awake, the quality of her attention sharpening. She started to ask something. He could hear the shape of the question forming before she got the words out. Yeah, he said, I know, I'm okay. He hung up. He found a vending machine down the corridor. The coffee it produced was bad, thin, slightly sour, approximating the flavor of coffee the way the bar on Meridian Station approximated Red Horse, which was to say, if you didn't think too hard about what you were tasting, it did the job. He drank it. He stood in the corridor on Juno platform with a bad coffee and a burn patch that itched and 2 missing fingers and the Var'Keth Dominion's pending further data. And he finished the coffee and he went back to work.